Thanks so much for coming. My name is Nick Voss, Education Outreach Coordinator for VLAWMO, which is the Vadnais Lake Area Water Management Organization. So, we have 4 parts to the presentation. The first one and most important is getting to know our lakes. Every lake has its own story and its own management plan, and on a deeper level, these are your water resources. We're not exactly a popular White Bear Lake or a popular Minneapolis chain of lakes, but we do have very unique water bodies, unique water resources that are only fitting to this area with certain cities and certain management plans that don't fit anywhere else. We'll talk about some past projects that we've covered and our future goals. We just started a 10-year plan from 2017 to 2026 for watershed management. And my favorite part is opportunities for residents to be involved, because we're a small staff of 5, but a watershed is a team effort for sure. Some of the basics: we're one of the smallest, which is why we're so unique. We're only 25 square miles. We were established in 1983 out of a joint powers agreement with these 6 cities: Gem Lake, Lino Lakes, North Oaks, White Bear Lake, White Bear Township, and Vadnais Heights. The mission is to protect and enhance the water resources in the watershed, which is a simple way to say water monitoring, education outreach, wetland protection, and water quality enhancement projects. All of those are kind of chunky terms. It's kind of a mouthful, but I'll explain how that happens on a project basis. We have 17 lakes, we have Lambert Creek, and over 500 wetlands. So why organize and why have an organization focused on water quality? We're not exactly, like I said, recreation public access watershed. Most of our lakes don't have public access, but we do have a lot of recreation for fishing, boating, and even a water ski club. So our lakes do experience recreation. Groundwater, what happens on the surface, is the precursor to groundwater in the long term. We have drinking water. One of the reasons why we're so unique is that our watershed leads to the St. Paul Regional Water Service. About 50 to 80% of St. Paul Regional Water Service's drinking water comes from the Mississippi, but the rest of that, sometimes half, comes from our area. And that's why we meet with them and we work to keep this water clean on the front end. Property values can be higher when when clean water is nearby. Habitat, clean water, and our projects come with a bonus of habitat for waterfowl, pollinators, fish. And we're a part of a larger effort. We have a nationwide effort for clean water. So over the last 50 years, coastal freshwater wetlands have declined. Surface water and groundwater withdrawals have increased 46%. And so we're searching for a balance with that. We have development and needs, but we also have long-term sustainability. More on the state level, 40% of Minnesota's lakes and streams are impaired for conventional pollutants. By conventional, we mean more long-term subtle pollutants. We mostly focus on sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen. It's not exactly what we're used to seeing with Lake Superior being directly dumped with wastewater or sewage, but these are the equivalent of a person eating ice cream for dinner and having way too much and getting a stomachache in lakes. So these are very dynamic shallow lakes, and because shallow lakes receive runoff and are reflective of what's on the landscape, they can flip, and it takes a lot of work to get them back to clean water states if they do flip. So too many nutrients, they flip into a turbid water state with high amounts of algae and not as much aquatic vegetation. So we're always watching this delicate balance as we monitor and keep tabs on the water bodies. The other part is that the longer it goes in a turbid state, the harder it'll be to bring it back to clean water. So it's a tricky thing because it's always kind of in the background when everybody's focused on other things. It's not directly harming anything. But we're here to focus on that so it doesn't get too far into the norm where it's just a big mess. So this is what our landscape looked like before settlement. It's just a reference because this is how the water cycle worked in this area. We had oak savanna, wet meadows, prairies, and lots of wetlands. Glacial deposit of till created poor drainage on our landscape. And unlike up north where you get the kettle pothole lakes, we had places where drainage was poor and wetlands were made. And that's what we have to work with today. So this is a 1848 survey with our watershed boundary put on top of it. There's two things that we can see. A lot of the water bodies had been shallow lakes that were consolidated into more convenient lakes so that development, agriculture could fit around them. And large networks of wetlands were also pooled together, so it made it easier to build. And this is kind of like, say, you're working on a puzzle of puppies, and your older sibling comes and says, no, we're working on cats, and there's a new puzzle right on top of it. And neither puzzle is bad in itself, but the big issue now is to make both puzzles fit together, and that means a lot of intricate details. So the last 50 years, the changes on the landscape are what we're trying to work with so that the water is clean as it was in the natural state. And this is what we have after the years of development. What we're working with is a number of impaired lakes on the state impaired list. And these are red on this map. Goose, West Vadnais, Gilfillan, Wilkinson, Gem. The purple and yellow are impaired for mercury, and purple is nutrients and mercury together. Excuse me. This is how water moves through VLAWMO. We start up at the top. I'll just kind of come back. In Lino Lakes, and it moves through a chain of lakes down the Vadnais. It comes from the Mississippi. St. Paul Regional Water Service has 2 conduits that bring up to 32 million gallons per day through Charley. And then we get more water from the east through East Goose Lake and White Bear Lake stormwater runoff. And that comes through Lambert Creek into Vadnais. Other lakes flow northward and back around through Pleasant and into the same spot. We have a couple water bodies that are isolated, but for the most part, all that water goes to East Vadnais. And like I mentioned, we work with St. Paul Regional Water Services on a monthly basis. So we're planning, we're just always in the know, and we have the same goals. There's some challenges to this. We have things like a lack of a buffer. Buffers are beneficial for storm ponds, wetlands, lakes, streams, because they do just that. They hold water and they hold nutrients on the landscape. It's kind of just creating a tidy, structured landscape. And open spaces can then attract geese, which bring more nutrients through droppings, and runoff with shallow-rooted areas bring in more nutrients and sediment than if a buffer were there. Grass clippings on a street, again, this is the ice cream issue. Phosphorus and the nutrients in the grass clippings are natural, but too much leaves us with more nutrients than what the lakes are used to, because every storm drain goes right to a lake or a wetland. Trash goes along with that, anything that's on the street. And then there's illicit discharges. It's illegal to dump something like a mop bucket, chemicals, or say carpet cleaning into storm drains. Infrastructure issues like eroded culverts are an issue. They bring sediment into lakes and streams. That brings more nutrients, and sediment is something that would, for example, clog gills of fish if it gets too much, and it's also just expensive to fix. And this one here, which our staff member Brian is perplexed by, is now fixed, but there's other areas that one by one we take attention to. So this is a visual of a shallow rooted buffer where there's 55% runoff and 15% infiltration. Then a deep rooted buffer with native plants typically has 10% runoff and 50% excuse me, infiltration. So that is a way that as water levels ebb and flow with rain events, these roots and the plants will slow water and hold this water and actually replenish groundwater that way, opposed to having more runoff. So this is a shoreline restoration in action. And this is a video for the story of stormwater. Starting in White Bear Lake, this is Whitaker Pond. There's a Band-Aid going through there. And let's see, it gets messy. You know, no one tries to do it, but somehow, you know, some things just fly out and get through. And then everything starts flowing through Lambert Creek. And our staff monitor Lambert Creek in several locations. It's a creek that's impaired for E. coli. So we're studying how that happens and how to fix it. And then it all empties into Vadnais Lake. This is what it looks like on the other end. After stormwater comes, the flip side is, this is what I mean when water flips into a turbid state. The photosynthesis is happening in the water instead of in plant life. So then the water is not clean, basically. So we facilitate what's called the Wetland Conservation Act, abbreviated as WACA. It's 1991 Minnesota legislation that guarantees a no net loss of wetlands. So if there's development happening or there's infringement on a wetland, there's a procedure in place to say that has to be replaced somewhere else or credits have to be purchased elsewhere in the state. So we go on site and we have checks and ways to inform businesses, homeowners, how to work along with this procedure. And sometimes this means it happens to homeowners. It's a cultural shift on how we treat our wetlands. It might be appealing to dump a bunch of soil and extend the yard, plant turf, and just have an easy kept grass, lawn. And the wetland can move back a little. The problem is it chips away at what wetlands are offering us. So that's the water purification, flood protection, shoreline stabilization, groundwater recharge, stream flow maintenance, and valuable habitat. So luckily this situation was remedied. We spoke with the residents and the dirt was pulled back and wetland was brought back. Because we've lost roughly half of Minnesota wetlands already, every one of them is really valuable. So we're trying to get that education piece that they're important for the big picture. Another Wetland Conservation Act example is the latest Goodwill on Centerville Road. A lot of planning went into this to have this property follow WACA as well as work for Goodwill. So we went through about 3 different drafts, and there's this picture here is a curb cut and water is being drained into underground retention basins. And then there's other preserved wetlands around the back of the building. So in the end, it worked for everybody, and that's the goal. So in terms of our lakes and getting to know our sense of place, all of this information is found on our website with water bodies. We have flyers, handouts of our lake fact sheets in the back, so if you see a lake that you are near or most interested in, feel free to grab a fact sheet, and find these on our website. So every lake has a letter grade. This comes from a rating system called the Trophic Scale Index, TSI, but that value is an average of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. What VLAWMO staff does is converts it into a letter grade just so it's a little more familiar. So Amelia, this is our lake up in Lino Lakes, our northernmost lake. It's only 4 feet deep, 195 acres, and 35E has agriculture draining into it, and it flows into Wilkinson, which is just to the south. So Amelia is doing very well. We haven't done any direct projects here because it hasn't needed it, but we monitor and we hope to keep it that way. This graph shows a number of our lakes. This red line is the state standard for phosphorus. And Amelia here in the middle, we see from 2010 to 2016 is always under state standard. So this is just a nice simple graph because it contains all of our lakes compared to state standard. We have graphs that where we could overwhelm everybody with all of our graphs, but I'll just stick to this one for this time so that we can just get a consistent comparison. And the drainage for Amelia, right at the top, includes 35E, and this map really shows that team effort where everybody living or working in this sub-watershed is a part of that lake. Wilkinson to the south, and 35E again. Wilkinson's a larger drainage. Apologies, the slides got mixed up because we were avoiding too many microphone switches for the camera, and this one will follow the Wilkinson spotlight. So Black Lake is in North Oaks. It's an A-. This is a hidden gem of a lake. It's 12.5 feet deep, 11 acres. This is the only lake we have that contains wild rice. Other native plants such as water lilies and coontail. It's secluded from runoff loads. There's a conservation easement in North Oaks, and there's a bog that surrounds this lake. So it's very protected, and we're glad that it will likely stay that way. So it's free of invasive species. Purple loosestrife is present, but it's not appearing to dominate. To monitor, our staff bring a canoe in waders, and we gently walk over the floating bog as it kind of ripples nervously. And we take the boat out and we take our water samples every other week in the summer. So Black Lake here, doing very well, and we're going to keep that. This is the watershed. Most of this is the conservation easement, and there's a low amount of residential properties around it. Pleasant Lake is a B. It's in North Oaks. It is 58 feet deep. We have 2 deep lakes. This is one of them. 102 acres. It's the largest lake in VLAWMO, and it's kind of up and down close to that impairment line, but it is improving. Because it's deep, it has a different standard than shallow lakes. Instead of 20 micrograms per liter, it's 40. The oxygenation system is what the St. Paul Regional Water Service installed, and that binds phosphorus from entering into the water. It keeps it in the sediment. So that's a part of the improvements that we've been seeing on Pleasant recently. Pleasant is a challenge with the shoreline. It receives a high amount of fluctuation with the water service going up and down, depending on water demand. So this is an example of erosion on the shoreline. It might freeze and then the water drops, and this action of wind and ice push into the shoreline and gradually wear it away. This is just a nice picture of Pleasant Lake. It actually is very pleasant. And Pleasant is connected to Deep and Charley lakes. Charley, as you see, is right where water is coming in from the Mississippi. So a large watershed, over 1,000 acres. Gilfillan is a C+ lake in North Oaks, 7 feet deep, 102 acres. It's impaired for high nutrients, but our studies show it's mostly internal loading. So that means things are already in the sediment, and adjustments to the landscape over time have caused this sediment to be there, kind of consolidated together. The VLAWMO helped with a shoreline restoration on the shoreline. Gilfillan here in the middle, up. It may be soon removed from the impair list because it has gotten better. Shoreline restoration was in 2015, and that's what it looks like a few days ago. And we have some folks here, I think, who was a part of that. So this is the watershed for Gilfillan. It's a great example of different cities that have the same lake in its drainage. So even if Vadnais Heights doesn't really worry about Gilfillan because it's a North Oaks lake, Vadnais Heights runs into the watershed. So this is how we always work with cities to plan street sweeping, developments, and stormwater runoff so that not one city bears the burden of a dirty lake. And takes a lot of teamwork and effort. Goose, east and west, this is a lake that has really had a rough life. West is a D, east is a D minus. They are connected with under the street culverts. This is White Bear Lake. West is 4 feet, east gets 6 feet deep. West is 25, east is 125 acres. Goose historically was more of a wetland, and this is the lake that perhaps has been most modified to become a lake instead of a wetland, but it has a memory of being a wetland, so it has internal loading, and Highway 61 was built right in between them. So it's impaired for nutrients because the wetlands naturally hold those nutrients, and now as a lake we're trying to flip that over, and it has so many unique circumstances. I don't really think there's a lake like this anywhere in the country. We have a commercial area, we have residential, there's a water ski team, there's a car dealership, there's an industry, there is the city, and even county, state interests. Perhaps others that I'm missing. Any? Yeah. So nobody's trying to harm the lake or keep it in an unhealthy state, but it has a high requirement for communication and planning. We all want the same thing, but it's been several years of planning, and there's good things happening. There's more to come with Goose Lake, but it really shows that water quality reflects what the collective wants, and if we really want it and work together, a lot is possible. So it's back to that puzzle analogy that I talked about earlier. West Goose is over here, quite a bit above the state standard. East Goose on this side. So we've done a number of vegetation fish surveys to better understand the lake. We've analyzed the rough fish population, rough fish being bullhead and carp, things that are bottom feeders that stir up the sediment that's already nutrient rich. We have just a few pictures from that. A soft-shelled turtle out of Goose Lake, which is pretty neat. We have water skiers. And this is the drainage. We have 239 acres on West Goose and 578 on East. We have a golf course. That's the other piece that I forgot as stakeholders. We have industry. We have residential. So all of this drainage from White Bear comes basically through a channel along Highway 61, and as I'm sure many have driven by there, it's a common place. And this is what it looks like. This channel, over time, is ripping away at the shoreline, and you just see these pockets where when this soil's lost, it's just gone. And it's filling the channel, and there's a spit of sediment in East Goose Lake. So it's not good for the road. It's not good for the parking lot on the left in the long term. And this is an example of just something that takes all the players to figure something out together. This is the culvert connecting East and West Goose Lake under Highway 61. So as you see, the water gets pretty soupy, pretty green, and the incoming runoff is also important in addition to what's already in the lake. So it even takes residents and people helping out with stormwater runoff, which I'll mention in a little while.
So I'm going to talk about a few of our other lakes. This is Gem Lake. Gem Lake is located in the city of Gem Lake. That took a lot of work to name it. It is a lake that is completely its own unit. It doesn't outlet. It would have to take a 100-year storm event. It would have to take Houston, what's happening in Houston, for it to overflow, because the landscape around it is very steep going down to it. And so everything just kind of runs into it, and that's where it stays. So we'd have to get so much water for it to rise up high enough to overflow. So where most of our lakes all end up linking to one another, Gem Lake is its own little water body and watershed. It's 17 feet deep and about 40 acres in size. It has no public access. It's homeowners that are all directly around it. We haven't found any invasive plants or fish so far. It has been on the impaired list for nutrients. However, we are in the process of getting it delisted. The Pollution Control Agency is the agency that gives the yes or no for what's impaired or not impaired. And it's currently being reviewed and should be off next year if all goes well. And that's, again, showing what Nick has said about the cooperation of all kinds of partners to make something happen. And as I said, it's isolated. With that said, we still get times in the summer where it'll get green, and that's why we monitor all the time. That's why we don't ignore a lake, because as the summer progresses and the heat rises, you'll maybe get like a little bloom of algae, and so we're always watching it, monitoring, paying attention, seeing how long it lasts, when it dissipates. So again, going back to the chart, Gem Lake is this one right here. So why I say it's going off the impaired list, as you can see, there's that red line, and in 2010 it was really close, but it was still below. And in 2009 to 2010, the Minnesota Department of Transportation put in, they reconstructed along Highway 61, and they reconstructed in the area that drains into into Gem Lake. And what they did is they created what's called swales, which is where the water can run off and it gives it time to soak into the ground prior to running into a water body. They put those in, and our water quality has gotten even better. So it's consistently staying below standard. And so that's why the PCA is reviewing it, doing the work that they have to do so that it can be officially delisted, which is a huge win for the watershed and for all the partners involved. So this is the sub-watershed that feeds into Gem Lake. And like I said, it's private homes all around it directly. But we do have some of the golf course in the area, and this is the Ford dealership right at County Road E and 61. So there's some industry. And then I believe this is more homeowners as well. But you can see how wooded it is around it. This is all basically wetland, this part of the lake and over in here. So that acts as a natural filter as well. But it's been great to see a lake improve. You want me to do Vadnais, huh? Okay. Vadnais is at the bottom of the watershed. That's our end point for most of the water in the watershed. There's West Vadnais and then there's East Vadnais. They are not connected, but they are right next to each other with a road going through them. West Vadnais is a C-, so it's not as good water quality. East is a B+, and I think a lot of that is due to the fact that the St. Paul Water Utility does a lot of work in the lake itself to make the water cleaner before it moves on to their facility for further cleaning. So both lakes are in Vadnais Heights. West, they're very different lakes, as you'll see from these statistics. West Vadnais is only 9 feet deep. East Vadnais is our other deep lake, 58 feet deep. So two completely different water bodies. The sub-watershed area running into West Vadnais is 213 acres, which is actually really pretty small. Or I'm sorry, no, that's the size of the lake. Forget I just said that. 213 acres is the size of the lake for West Vadnais, 389 acres for the east side. So east is slightly bigger than west, and the sub-watershed areas are going to be different too. West is impaired for nutrients, so that grade of C-, it's impaired for phosphorus loading. And we haven't quite figured out how we're going to change that around. We've been focusing a lot on Goose and on Wilkinson Lake most recently. And as I said, east and west are not connected. Between the lakes, there's this lovely walking path, and there's lots of shoreline fishing that happens around there. VLAWMO worked with Ramsey County Parks to help with some of the restoration work that they did. And we also helped fund a permeable paver kind of walkway area. So that's those patio blocks like you'd see, but they're made in a special way so that when the water hits it, it actually will soak through and go into the ground rather than run off. And between Pleasant and East Vadnais is Sucker Lake. We don't have a whole lot of information on that lake itself, so we didn't make a separate slide for it, but it is the conduit between Pleasant Lake and Vadnais Lake. So it's kind of just the St. Paul Water Utility water runs right through it. It's surrounded by park. We're planning to do a restoration project along the channel from 96 when the channel goes under County Highway 96, and that channel is really beat up. If you guys ever go to Sucker Lake Park and walk around, the channel is just deteriorating and looks really bad. So we're doing a project in cooperation with a lot of agencies, St. Paul Water Utility, Ramsey County Parks, City of Vadnais Heights, Ramsey Conservation District. Did I miss anyone? I don't know if I said Ramsey County Parks, but we're dealing with them too, to redo this whole area. So if all goes well, that'll start this fall. So this map just shows you how Sucker Lake, so Pleasant's way up at the top, and then Sucker, and then it comes down into Vadnais. Is 394 saying the sub-watershed? Yeah. Okay. So 394 acres is what drains into West Vadnais, where almost 900 acres drains into East. And so when I said earlier that the drainage is really different between the two lakes, this is what I meant. With West Vadnais, there's no silver bullet that we know of yet as to why the nutrient levels are so high. One of the things that I will always look at when I first start tackling this is what's going on in the sub-watershed. But the sub-watershed for West Vadnais is really, it's like just this little area of land like right above it and the little sliver down there. So I don't have too much to work with in that regard. So it's on within that 10-year water plan that we talked about before, that we'll start doing some studies to figure out what's exactly happening in that lake.
Okay, Lambert Creek. This is a puzzle of our watershed. It's a former agriculture ditch and now functions as basically a creek. It starts in White Bear Lake, not actual White Bear Lake, but in the city, and it comes into Vadnais Lake. It's 4.2 miles. It has 3,658 acres that drain into it, which is mostly a stormwater issue, stormwater runoff. And like I said, agriculture. And it is impaired for E. coli. And I'll talk about that with some studies. We have 6 locations where we monitor Lambert Creek, and most of these are also high in phosphorus, above the state standard. So, concerning E. coli, what our staff does is we're trying to study where it's coming from and basically how we'll lower it. We've compared the water with the sediment, underlying sediment of the creek. So in red you see the sediment core samples. In blue we see the water column. So we can see that at these different stations, different testing points, there's something in the sediment. But then the question is, where's that sediment coming from? How's it getting to the sediment? Here is what we just customized the name and created the word pollutograph because it's basically a graph of the pollution. Staff are pretty dedicated to this. I'm impressed by sometimes 3 a.m. mornings or whenever a storm is hitting, monitoring every 15 minutes. And at a gauge at the creek, the blue line here is the flow rate. As water's coming in after a storm, the flow increases, and periodically, all of these symbols, circle, green square, X's, are the E. coli readings at these different test sites. So they go up when the stormwater increases, and it stays up when stormwater decreases. So it tells us something's coming from the landscape, and it's just kind of lingering there even after the rain subsides. It takes a while for it to move out. So enough is coming from the landscape to keep it up high. These are the test sites I mentioned, down here and one over here. This is County Road F and Centerville, and this is that particular sub-drainage that comes into Lambert Creek. And the purple is interesting because that's all storm drains, and each one is a part of these readings. So everything on that landscape is, a suspect. But not just here. This is consistent throughout all of Lambert Creek. We've noticed that the primary type of E. coli is avian. So that's something, as we do some more fine-tuned studies, we'll look into further. So it's a large watershed, drains into it. Lambert Creek has been a major focus of VLAWMO since we began in 1983. We've moved through different types of projects over the years. Right now we're mostly addressing local flooding and soggy yards. But we've done all of these projects in the last 20 years, starting in White Bear Lake, close to where it starts. This is Central Middle School, where we have an underground infiltration basin. We have a number of weirs, which is basically a dam, placed here at Rice Lake. We have one, let me think. We have one at County Road F and one at Whitaker Pond, and Oakmead in White Bear Township. That's the other one. So a weir is a way that we can take this creek and try to mimic how it wants to act, which is a wetland. When it does that, the water is held for a longer period of time, and sediments, contaminants, pollutants drain to the bottom, and they settle. And in a wetland, that would all be taken up by plant material. So Rice is surrounded by a wetland, Rice Lake here, and that's working. We created Lambert Lake in, that's in the future slide, I have the exact date, but it does the same thing where we're holding water for a time so that flooding is controlled as storm flashes go up and down, and we also have done a number of shoreline bank restorations along the creek where things have gotten eroded and it gets really messy. It's a great way to clean up the creek that way. Oakmead Weir in 1993, so that's a wall that holds water back. That's White Bear Township. Lambert Lake in 2005. Periodically, as you see this tiny little boat, VLAWMO staff goes around and measures the depth, and that tells us how sediment is collecting and moving through the lake. So, and some of these weirs, it's possible where we need to dredge them and get that sediment out of there, because it's not really a wetland. It's trying to act like a wetland. And we monitor and see that it's still working the way it's intended, which Lambert Lake this year, which is when this picture was taken, is doing just that since 2005. County Road F, again, 1993. Whitaker Weir in 2010. This is in, White Bear Township. The water was taken down for this to be built, but on the left now, if you were on site on Whitaker Road, the left side would be full of water. And several Lambert Creek bank restorations from 2010 all the way to this year. What happens with these is we actually clear a lot of vegetation that's primarily buckthorn or invasive honeysuckle. It's not exactly intuitive because taking vegetation out might look like an eyesore, but trees and that sort of vegetation aren't protecting the underlying soil. What happens is storm flashes go up and down, and although it's vegetated, then we get more debris cut away with the soil, and more falls into the creek over time. So when our restorations come in play, we're using native plants, grasses that have very strong root structures, and instead of a tree that's just kind of coming right from the ground up, the collection of native plants slow down any water coming in, and it's more stable to the bank. But instead of just grasses, we use other shrubs like dogwood, and that will fill in the bank so it's very lush over time. But in general, that stabilizes along with the erosion blankets. These are what's called coir logs. It's all natural debris that creates these steps and repairs that shoreline. These are, I forgot, some I have other pictures of the restoration later. With Wilkinson, this is back up in the north, a D+, in North Oaks, 4.5 feet deep, 94 acres. Sometimes the chain of lakes channel can reverse its flow, and there's carp in the chain of lakes in Pleasant Lake. So there's a fish barrier here at Wilkinson to stop carp, and that's advantageous for Wilkinson's already impaired water quality. So it's impaired for high phosphorus. It's both internal and external. We worked with Ramsey Conservation District this year to do a vegetation study and a bathymetry study, which means studying the depth and taking a very detailed reading of the topography of the base of the lake. Wilkinson is here in the middle, in the last few years consistently over the state standard of phosphorus. This is the result, like I mentioned, the reading of the depth. This helps us understand how the lake behaves with sediments as well as overwintering, where pockets of oxygen might help fish survive, and that all informs our management plan. And it's a wonderful lake for wildlife. A lot of waterfowl, mink, beaver. Again, the North Oaks area has this conservation easement right up against Wilkinson Lake, so it's a great spot, including an osprey nest. Charley and Deep. Let's see, Charley is a C, Deep is a C minus. North Oaks, Charley is 21 feet, Deep is not as deep, 11, 38 and 70 acres respectively. So Charley, like we mentioned, receives water from the Mississippi. Deep is very interesting. We haven't prioritized it yet because we're focusing more on Wilkinson upstream. But being impaired for phosphorus, it's also low on chlorophyll, which means plants are uptaking chlorophyll. And usually it would be high in chlorophyll because that would be in the water column. So it's an interesting lake. Somehow, even having high phosphorus and lots of algae, it's still able to produce plants. Usually that would not be the case because the algae and turbid water would block the sunlight so plants can't exist. So we're yet to study and look into that. Charley here, it's been pretty low before, but most of that water is Mississippi water, and Deep is pretty consistently above the state standard. So wetlands have a natural process over time to fill in, and above Charley, this is a historical, more of a lake called Long Lake, but is filled in to become a wetland. Over time, as we develop, it kind of speeds up that process. So that's helping Charley as a wetland. Here's the conduit coming in, and Deep Lake, similar size in its watershed. These are shoreline restorations we've done at Charley Lake. And here's a photo of the conduits coming in from the Mississippi. This is a Deep Lake restoration at the channel between Deep Lake and Pleasant Lake.
So Birch Lake is, like Nick said, it's kind of my lake. I've done a lot of work on it. It is probably our best lake in the watershed, and it's located within the city of White Bear Lake. County Road Highway 96 is to the south of it, 35E is to the east of it, and there's a bunch of homes and commercial areas around it, and it has stayed healthy. Whoops, wrong direction, Chris. It's only 6 feet deep, about 125 acres in size, and it's very clean. You can see the bottom of the lake all the time. It's wonderful. It has a very active homeowners association called the Birch Lake Improvement District, who on their own came to the city of White Bear Lake and said, we would like to be charged extra taxes so that we can help take care of this lake. That's pretty cool to see that happen. They use some of their funding to manage some of the aquatic vegetation. So Birch Lake has a lot of aquatic vegetation, and that's one of the reasons why it's so healthy, because the aquatic plants take the nutrients that are coming into it and they use it. They eat it up and use it rather than letting it stay in the lake and turn into algae. So the Birch Lake Improvement District spends some of their money to use a harvester, and they can harvest about 30% of the lake vegetation to kind of create paths for recreation where it's most needed, and still maintain that balance. That scale that we showed you before about keeping that balance of healthy in the lake, that's a fine balance, but we carefully monitor the lake, and the Birch Lake Improvement District obviously wants it to stay healthy as well. They've headed up some of the studies for fish surveys and vegetation surveys. They also stock the lake with bass and walleye and things like that. They have been very active in working with the Watershed to get projects to start, including helping to fund it. Also, the homeowners, it's spreading the word about our grant programs that help fund shoreline restorations. And so there's a number of homeowners along the lake that have utilized that grant program. So again, it's all about that partnership, about working together. And that handy dandy chart, you can see Birch is way down there. And in 2016, that number, that little bar, you can barely even see it. It's so low, which is just, it's wonderful. So one of the projects that we did, when I first started here about 10 years ago, we wrote a plan called a Sustainable Lake Management Plan. And we work on one lake every year, writing SLMPs. This year I'm working on the Charley Lake one, but when I first started here it was the Birch Lake one. And part of our assessment in writing that plan is just kind of looking at all the aspects of the lake, the kind of whole little ecosystem, and figuring out, you know, what's going on, what are some things that we can be doing to help the lake. And one of the things that we found were some areas along the shoreline that were showing signs of erosion. So this particular spot is on the north side of the lake, and people were accessing the lake, walking on the trail and just coming down to the lake and fishing along the shoreline or just wanting to get close to the water. I mean, that's a pretty normal thing to see happen, but you can see over time how it was causing damage. So we worked with the City of White Bear Lake. We got a grant through the Ramsey Conservation District, so that's the county. We worked with the Birch Lake Improvement District, and we did a shoreline restoration, about 700 feet long shoreline restoration. And we did it in 2 phases. We did one that was really more showy, like really bright colors with a little walking path down to the lake so that people could access the lake still. And we made it really pretty. And there is a sitting bench there as well. And then for the rest of the shoreline, that was about 130 feet, that part. And then the rest of it, it's native, but it's not as accessible. So the shoreline's a lot steeper there. And our goal was just, let's just make sure we get some native vegetation here and really strengthen the shoreline and give the folks an access point. So that's what that really showy part looks like. It's a beautiful spot. If you guys ever walk around Birch Lake, I highly recommend stopping by there. There's a little pathway down to the lake. There are still people trampling through and creating their own little pathways. It has been a battle that you see all the time when you see shoreline restorations. I've tried everything, and I haven't quite found what's going to be the answer to keep people from doing it. But the good news is that the site's actively maintained. We're always out there, not us personally, but a business that we work with to do maintenance is always out there checking on it, finding any spots that might need immediate attention. And again, we work with the Birch Lake Improvement District to help pay for that maintenance, and the City of White Bear Lake and VLAWMO all come together to help maintain that. It has a 647 acre watershed, and this map really shows you all the diverse things that are flowing into that lake. So you have 35E, County Road 96. This is all business area, and we were like getting into like where Cub Foods is and stuff like that up at Centerville and County Road 96. That all flows down into Birch. There's dense home developments right here. There's a school right here, more commercial and housing right there. And then Otter Lake Road hugs right on the side right there. So it's an oddity to have a lake be this healthy with this much stuff going on around it. And so we work really hard to make sure it's staying healthy. We just applied for a grant to do a little project right in this corner right here that would help filter all the runoff that comes in from this area before it enters the lake. So we're always looking and trying to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to a lake such as this that's nice and healthy. Again, the fine balance. Tamarack Lake. So Tamarack Lake is located within Tamarack Nature Center, which is in White Bear Township. It has a grade of D. It's 10 feet deep. Now, when I did the SLMP report for that lake, we went out and we did a depth map of the lake, and everyone always thought that it was about 6 feet deep and it was shaped like a bathtub. You know, it just went down and was up on the sides. What we found is it had 2 deep pockets of about 9 to 10 feet deep. Now, is that super deep? No, but when something's that deep, that changes what can live in that lake. So that meant that there could be some fish that could overwinter. It wasn't so shallow that it would completely freeze out. It changes the dynamics of what we could be thinking about is what's happening in that lake. So it's just the work that we do, we're always uncovering new information. So it's a small lake, only about 15 acres in size. Of the fish that we've been able to find, it's mostly just minnows and bullheads, which are bottom feeding fish. They stir things up in the bottom, but nonetheless, it's good to know what's going on in there. It's impaired for nutrients, phosphorus levels. It's pretty bad. And it's within the Tamarack Nature Center, and what makes that interesting, oh, that's one of the projects, it's surrounded by a nature center. There's no direct runoff. There's no, again, no magic bullet we can say, that's what's causing the lake to be unhealthy. But we do know that the area before it was a nature center, it was farmland. And so there was a lot of runoff that went in there before, and it's probably been modified over the years too. And anecdotally, I know that they pulled cow carcasses out of that water body. They've pulled dynamite out of that water body. So you never know what's going on in a lake to cause what we see today. It's all part of what gives us job security, trying to figure this stuff out. One of the things that we've done to just see if it might help change some of the water quality is we installed what's called a floating wetland. And it's a wetland made out of recycled like plastic materials. And it's webbed all together and filled with like the medium that helps grow plants, and then filled with native plants. And we launched that out into the lake. And the theory behind it is that that's adding the vegetation that helps use up phosphorus, much like Birch Lake, which has it in its system already. This is kind of recreating that. And we're monitoring it. We're seeing if we're going to see any benefits from it or not. There's a lot of variables involved, but at least we're trying something, knowing that we can't really change anything around the lake. We're trying to figure out what we could do to help it, no matter what. So going back to our chart, Tamarack is this one right here. So you can see it's always high above that state standard line. But it's a really pretty place. If you guys haven't been there, highly suggest you go there. The beautiful, huge tamarack trees right around the lake, they're magnificent, and they're going to be turning yellow right now. I'm a plant geek. I can't help it. This is the subwatershed map for Tamarack. So you can see it's got a pretty large subwatershed, a lot of stuff running towards it. There's Birch Lake, a really, really healthy lake that outlets to the north. And I wouldn't say it really directly feeds over, because it would have to cut over and across, you know, but it's still, that water is all part of the same system. With Tamarack, some water comes off of 35E and goes through a series of wetlands, then goes into Tamarack, comes down and around, goes to this small water body called Fish Lake, which is really deep, but really small in size, crosses back under 35, and then hooks up into this chain that eventually would go up into Wilkinson Lake. One of our other activities, water monitoring, like we've talked about. We have staff that go out every other week collecting water samples, and we watch that data all year. We create an annual report. You can go onto our website. We have them all listed. If you want to look at data and lots of graphs, go there. You'll find it. Our monitoring program, we work with volunteers to help on some of the lakes, and that picture is of Mr. Ron Auger, who passed away last year, but he was a volunteer on the lake for like 50 years doing like lake level monitoring and stuff like that. A really great gentleman, I miss him. And then we also have automated samplers. We have one that we're actually getting, we're trying to collect some data in that area of Birch Lake that I said we're going to be doing a project. We want to get pre-data so then we can compare afterwards. Another water quality thing that we look at is chloride. Oh no, that's chlorophyll, sorry. That's the stuff that then turns into algae. So it's connected to the phosphorus. And that red line shows you the state standard. And you can see the same lakes that are high in phosphorus almost always are high in chlorophyll as well. So they go hand in hand for the most part. And then we also check for chloride. That's the road salt. So the salt that's coming off the roads during the winter flows into the lakes. And if it gets too high, it's really heavy and it holds down into the bottom of the lake, and it will make a lake not turn over like it's supposed to. So it's natural for a lake to turn over. And if you have too much chloride, it's so heavy it holds the lake in place and it doesn't do that turnover. So far, luckily, despite what it looks like you see these large lines and you think, oh, that's scary. We're all of our lakes are well below average, or well below standard, forgive me. And we are always monitoring for it. Again, it's just something we're keeping our eye on. We want to make sure we stay on top of it if we start to see something happening that would give us time to try and reverse it. Real quick, some of the projects we've done. The grant program is something that I manage, and so we've worked with White Bear Montessori on 3 big projects with them. This one last year was putting in some really large rain gardens as part of their huge playground restoration or reconstruction. So that's one where a lot of water goes right in there. Those are baby tamarack trees and dogwood shrubs, and the water soaks into the ground. These gardens are meant to be inundated with water, and they're designed in a way that all the water soaks in within 24 hours. So it's a engineered best management practice is what it's called, but it will allow the water to soak in rather than run off. And this is another one that they put in another spot, and you can see it's engineered with this brick wall to help create kind of that basin for the water to collect and then soak into the ground. Another one that we did through our grant programs is with a townhome association, Heritage Estates. The best way, well not the best way, but one of the best ways to capture a lot of nutrients is to do what's called a curb cut rain garden. So cutting into the curb of the street and collecting that water from the street before it runs down to a storm drain. So we did that here. That's the before. That's the construction. So this is where we cut out the curb, and there's this little pre-treatment basin, it's called, where the water runs into first before going through that little rock spillway and into a nice rain garden. And the community, the Townhome Association, came out and took part in the planting, and they've taken part in maintenance activities. And so there's that finished pre-treatment basin with the rock, river rock, and then that's the rain garden. So that rock then opens up, and it opens up into this big, beautiful rain garden. Central Middle School, that is in White Bear Lake. The area feeds into Lambert Creek. We found that there was a spot at Central Middle School, middle of their parking lot, that collected a lot of rainwater, and it did no infiltration. The soil was tightly compacted, so the water just flew right on down into the storm drains. So we got a grant, and we put in this underground treatment basin. The water flows into it from that whole sub-watershed of the school area, and it goes down into that pre-treatment basin that then will soak into the ground. And on top of it, we put all these lovely plants into a nice, whoa, that was weird, into a nice swale. So it's native plants, it's educational for the kids, it's very accessible for anyone to come and see, and it's really helping to reduce the flow down into the creek. And as Nick touched on earlier, Lambert Creek restoration, we've done a lot of work there. This is a before shot of the project that we worked on just in this past year. You can see how shaded, overgrown, how the sides of the creek are just slumping away. And they cleared vegetation so that they could end up planting better vegetation, and put in, they rebuilt the sides with those coir blocks, logs, that you end up planting into. And they put in what's called a drop structure. That's what that's showing a picture of them building that. The water was flowing through underground culverts along properties, and it would come out here and it would sweep down, and it just would tear the entire shoreline up. And in my 10 years here, we've tried to fix it 3 times. And finally we said, okay, we're bringing the big engineers out. And we put in what's called a drop structure, so it captures the water up high, sends it down into a pipe, and then into the creek. And so it's not tearing away the shoreline. So there's that where the water enters in, up on the hill. And this is what it looks like now. That area that was all overgrown with trees falling in and the creek slumping in on the sides. You can see how it's already looking a million times better. So a lot of our projects are paid through our grant program, our cost share program, which I run. So if you guys are ever interested in that, let me know. It helps homeowners put in rain gardens, do shoreline restorations, like if you want to tear out all kinds of invasive plants and put in a big native garden, come to me. We can maybe help offset some of the costs for that. I become really tight with my people that get grants. I mean, we talk a lot. I come out every year to check on how things are going. I'm available for assistance on all kinds of stuff because we want these projects to succeed. So these are just some of the pictures of some of our happy recipients. And there's me. That's at the Heritage Estates one, that townhome one. And it's not just for rain gardens. Like I said, this is a huge native prairie restoration. It is gorgeous, and it's so much fun, and the family takes such great care of it. And it can also work for rain barrels. So if you want to buy rain barrels, that is an easy way to do your part to help collect stormwater before it goes running off down the drains. And you can even get more than one. You can fill one up and then it overflows into the other one.
Like I mentioned earlier, we have a 10-year plan. This is how watershed management organizations and districts function. We say, here's a chunk of time, this is what we want to do. Our first priorities under our 10-year plan are focusing on Goose and Wilkinson. So that's Goose Lake, that's Wilkinson. Lambert Creek, continued partnerships and maintenance. Whitaker Treatment Wetlands, at the start of Lambert Creek, we're actually partnering with the U of M to bring water upwards into this area on the side of Whitaker Pond, and it's called the treatment wetlands. We have 3 types of porous material, absorbents, and we're going to test how each one absorbs contaminants, nutrients, and how they drain. And then we'll be able to decide, well, this one is better or worse, and what one's better for a long-term strategy here in this area. But that's also research at the U of M that's going to benefit watersheds around the state or even country. Eventually, we have a high goal. We're just very enthusiastic about it. No more lakes on the state impaired list. So it's just the end result, and if we're just straight up honest about it, we just got to keep that in sight. And involvement. It's a team effort. We're a small staff of 5, but if we want to actually make a difference and have no more lakes on this state impaired list, which we're one of the smaller watershed districts, we don't have as many water bodies to work with, so we can be hopeful about it. Here's some ways for involvement. We have information in the back and a sign-up for the Adopt a Drain program. It's also on our website under Get Involved. Adopt a Drain is the most direct, convenient way to make an impact on your local water for the better. So cleaning out your storm drain whenever it needs it, or even whenever it works for you, is much better than just leaving it and let it get clogged with leaves and debris. So under our program, we just ask participants to check the drain 3 times a month. We understand if you're busy, you might not be able to clean it every week, and that's totally fine. It might not even need it. Most of the time it's in the spring and the fall. But we just say check it, excuse me, check it 3 times a month, and we'll collect and keep data. So there's a packet that you get in the mail, and it explains how to collect and estimate how many how much grass clippings or leaves or trash that you're taking out, sand, salt. And then at the end of the year, we add that up, and we can say what's the difference, what impact are we making, sparing all that material from our lakes and wetlands. And then we report the data. Along with adopting a drain, this is a great program for community groups. It's storm drain stenciling. We have had schools, scout groups, even a group of nurses came to volunteer with us. And so we label storm drains just to get the word out that these aren't places for dumping, drains to lake. We also have markers that are more of a smaller feature to say the same thing, that attach to curbs. And here's some pictures of the middle schoolers at Sunrise and the nurses, a line of nurses helping out. Even if you're not interacting with us directly, everybody can play a part in watershed stewardship. So on our website we have resources, guides for how lawn care can benefit the watershed, and there's a lot out there with water-savvy lawn care. Landscaping with native plants, like we talked about, rain gardens, rain barrels. Fixing automotive leaks, being prompt, is a great way to just be mindful of the water, because everything that ends up on the pavement will go somewhere else. Washing cars on the lawn. This is part of the cultural shift, and I mention it because it would be humorous to see, and you'd be the neighborhood weirdo for a second, but it avoids all those suds from washing into storm drains as well. The alternative, of course, is going to a professional car wash, because those are required by law not to drain into water bodies. But it's kind of fun to think, like, what if we all just kind of started that culture of washing cars on the lawn? Phenology is a partnership we've had with the Minnesota Phenology Network, basically environmental monitoring. This is something you can do in your backyard, just watching ice out, watching when leaves bud or fall, flowering times, times when birds return from wintering. We have some resources and ways that you can get involved in that, and it just helps build that awareness of the watershed. It's not always about doing something and being active, which is good, but participating and enjoying the resources of the watershed, bring it full circle. Spring workshops right here in the fire department. Every spring we pack the place, and we have resources about rain gardens and native plants. So if you're interested in digging deep into that, learning about the cost share program, getting a head start with how you can change your landscaping in your yard, that's a great way to do that. So stay posted on our website and our email list, and you can see the postings for those workshops. Rain gardens, native plants. Community Blue is a grant program we have for an educational effort. This is an example. We had actor educators present to a White Bear Lake community event, and it was about water resources and water quality. And we put rain gardens on schools, and so that's a more holistic plan of not only just putting in the rain garden, but creating a plan for how's that rain garden going to be educational. Or some things that a community might come together and say, we want to be the educators ourselves, and VLAWMO helps give them the tools. So this is a project on Rice Lake, introducing beetles to control the purple loosestrife population, and helps restore that wetland to a more functional state. So we have a watershed action volunteer group, the WAVE, and that's a fun way to have rain garden cleanups. Rain gardens don't work unless they're an active cultural maintenance. Every year they require maintenance, and it helps them working and looking nice. So we work on that with volunteers. We pick up trash because it's just good to do. We have education materials volunteers help with, and we work on promotions and some at some occasions we plan and we get together and meet. So that's our last slide. Thank you for staying. There's multiple ways to connect with us with VLAWMO.org. We have social media outlets. We have more education videos on our YouTube channel with specific topics, and that cuts it for the presentation.